Today I'm going to be talking about derived clinical attributes. Within the Annotator for Clinical Data Configuration Editor, also known as the Domain Expert tool, is a class of artifacts known as derived clinical attributes. Derived clinical attributes can optionally be added to your cartridge as you are building up your model. A derived clinical attribute contains conditional logic and expressions that are used to derive further context and meaning from the clinical attributes discovered in your text. Because of this, derived clinical attributes are also sometimes referred to as inference rules. A commonly used example of a derived clinical attribute, which you may have seen in an earlier video, is BMI, which uses the body weight and height clinical attributes found in the text to derive a BMI value. Switching now to my demo to help illustrate things further. I'm at the main catalog page of the Annotator for Clinical Data Configuration Editor. For the purposes of this demo, I created a cartridge called Demo General Medical. Clicking on my cartridge and then taking the Edit option, you can see in the right-hand panel that there are three artifacts in my cartridge: UMLS 2019 AA Dictionary, a clinical attribute set called Demo General Medical, and a set of derived clinical attributes called Demo Female Obesity Derived Attributes. Moving from the right-hand panel to the center of the page is the main artifacts section comprised of the various artifact types: collapsing dictionaries, clinical attributes, filters, and derived concepts. You can see the list of existing derived clinical attributes that I have access to. Before starting from scratch when using derived clinical attributes, it is worthwhile to see if any of the existing sets can be reused for your particular use case. If creating a new set of derived clinical attributes is needed, you would come up here to the right-hand corner and click Create, and from the drop-down, select New Derived Clinical Attributes. In the pop-up, you will need to provide a name, you'll see the owner and the email are automatically filled in for you. Optionally, you can provide a description. You can optionally select one or more tags, and you can update the authorization level and the authorized editors to your preference. Clicking Create will create a new clinical derived attributes artifact that gets added to my cartridge. Clicking on the new derived clinical attribute set will open it up, and I can start adding new derived clinical attribute definitions by clicking the plus icon. I will go ahead and cancel, and then going back to the artifacts in my cartridge, I will remove Demo Derived. Next, opening the Demo General Medical Clinical Attributes set, you can see the list of clinical attributes that this cartridge is interested in discovering in text. This is what is meant by the term domain-specific. In this case, there are general medical related clinical attributes such as blood pressure, body weight, heart rate, patient age, etc. Next, opening the artifact Demo Female Obesity Derived Attributes. These are derived clinical attributes that were created to derive additional meaning from the clinical attributes discovered in the text. In this case, the intention is to derive female and female obesity related context. Looking at the list of derived clinical attributes, the first one is called menopausal. Clicking on the pencil icon to open it up, you see an assignments section, a rule scope section, a conditions section, and a description section. The assignments is a required section. An assignment includes a name, a preferred name, and an expression. The name field is where you provide the name of this derived clinical attribute that will be displayed if the conditions of this derived clinical attribute are met when analyzing the text you have provided. Next, the preferred name is an optional field. This can be used to provide further context about this particular derived clinical attribute. In this example, we specified postmenopausal. Lastly is the expression field. This required field is the value that will get displayed if the conditions of this derived clinical attribute are met when analyzing your text. An expression can be a static value, such as shown here with the value of post, or it can be a dynamic value that gets calculated when analyzing your text. I will show an example of a dynamic value momentarily. The one last thing to mention in the assignment section is the ability to create multiple assignment fields for this derived clinical attribute. By clicking the plus sign, I could create additional assignments that would get displayed when the conditions of this derived clinical attribute are met when analyzing your text. Moving on, I will next highlight the conditions section. The conditions section is optional, but this is where you define the conditions that must be met before this derived clinical attribute will get displayed or promoted when analyzing your text. If no conditions section is provided, then only the assignment section is used to determine what to display for this derived clinical attribute. In this menopausal example, there are two conditions listed. 1, the gender clinical attribute must have a value of female, and 2, the patient age clinical attribute must have a value greater than or equal to 57. Note also the must match setting. This is set to all in this example, which is the same thing as a conditional and, which says that both conditions must be met before this derived clinical attribute will be promoted. I will also mention that within the conditions section is a plus icon to add additional conditions and a subgroup icon. By clicking this icon, it adds a subgroup. Subgroups are a way of grouping sets of conditions. In this example, I could use subgroups to create a patient age group of conditions. Within the subgroup, I can click the plus icon to add one or more conditions that I want to associate to this subgroup. Next is the rule scope section. This is where you define the scope within your text that will be used for determining if the conditions of this derived clinical attribute were met. The options are single line, sentence, paragraph, or document. In this case, document is selected, which says consider the entire document span when determining whether the conditions have been met. The optional description section is where you can list any notes relevant to this derived clinical attribute for your purposes. And lastly, you can click the checkbox here to easily disable or enable this derived clinical attribute. This is useful when building up your model by trying out a variety of artifacts when analyzing your text. I will briefly highlight the rest of the derived clinical attributes shown here. Opening BMI. This is an example where there are no conditions that must be met, and the expression in the assignments section specifies a dynamic value. In this case, the clinical attributes body weight and height discovered in the text will be used to calculate the formula for BMI. This is the value that will get displayed when BMI is promoted. Note the context that is used to include a clinical attribute in your expression. Body weight is the name of the clinical attribute, and it is enclosed within curly brackets, and that is prefaced with a $sign. Likewise for height. The last three in this list are derived clinical attributes for adding context involving BMI. Opening one of these, it says to promote underweight with a value of yes if the patient's BMI is less than 18.5. In this case, the underweight derived clinical attribute is dependent on the results from the BMI derived clinical attribute. Because the derived clinical attributes are processed in the order that they appear in the list, ordering is very important when one derived clinical attribute depends on another. The last thing I want to highlight about this particular set of derived clinical attributes is this optional precondition field. This can be used to set a condition that must be met before any of the derived clinical attributes in this set will be processed. In this case, unless there is a gender clinical attribute discovered in my text with a value of female, none of these derived clinical attributes in this set will be processed. Next, switching to the Annotator for Clinical Data Configuration Editor Preview mode, let's see all of this in action. I have some pre-selected text that I will add here, which reads, the female patient was admitted to the hospital for chest pains. She is 57 years old, her blood pressure is 130/90, her height is 62 inches, and her weight is 138 pounds. She is a current smoker. For this demo, I'll go ahead and just use the default list of annotators, and I'll click Run. Checking the panel along the right-hand side, you see the clinical attributes list. This list contains both the clinical attributes and the derived clinical attributes that were discovered and derived in the text. You see that even though there was no specific mention of body mass index in our text, our BMI derived clinical attribute is displayed with a value that was calculated using the body weight and height clinical attributes. Moving down, for another example, is our menopausal derived clinical attribute. Clicking on it, you can see the text 57 years old is highlighted in the text. This means that the conditions that were specified in our derived clinical attribute were met, and as a result, our preferred name, postmenopausal, along with our static value post, are being displayed. In conclusion, the ability to derive additional meaning and context from the text using derived clinical attributes is an important feature in the Annotator for Clinical Data Configuration Editor. This concludes the demo.